From Wisconsin, Republican Senator Ron Johnson, and from Florida, Maryland Senator Ben Cardin. Gentlemen, let's start with the big picture. President Obama says that a half a century of sanctions, of isolation of Cuba, just hasn't worked. Here he is.
I don't anticipate overnight changes. But what I know deep in my bones is that if you've done the same thing for 50 years and nothing's changed, you should try something different if you want a different outcome.
Senator Johnson, and I guess that's the question. Why not engage Cuba? Why not expose it to Western values and Western capitalism, especially as the country is about to go through a generational change from the Castro brothers?
Good morning, Chris. Well, your panel was talking about North Korea. We relaxed sanctions on North Korea. We've relaxed sanctions on Iran. Has that worked? I mean, the fact of the matter is these are repressive regimes. And, I agree, 50 years of this kind of policy, unfortunately, it hasn't worked, but it's not necessarily because it's a bad policy. By the way, it's the Helms-Burton Act was actually passed in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion and signed by President Clinton. So on a bipartisan fashion, this has been the policy of the United States for 50 years, and Helms-Burton is 18 years. And I would argue it's not because it's bad policy, it's because we're dealing with very bad and evil people, a repressive regime that has backed terrorists around the world and is going to threaten the national security of America and not improve the lives of the Cuban people.
Well, Senator Cardin, that's the other side of the argument you hear, that President Obama has given up too much to the Cubans in return for too little. Here is another member of your Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Marco Rubio.
These changes will lead to legitimacy for a government that shamelessly, continuously abuses human rights, but it will not lead to assistance for those whose rights are being abused.
And just to add to that, Cuban President Raul Castro pledged in a speech before his parliament yesterday, Senator Cardin, that his government will not abandon communism.
Chris, I can assure you that we will continue to point out the faults of the Cuban system, and we will speak out against human rights. But one thing is clear: the more American business people that interact with Cubans, the more Americans that have a chance to interact with Cubans, the more the Cubans will realize that their current system is failing them and will want the benefit of a more open society. That, I think, is clear. But we will stay strong in our message on violations of human rights. We've done that in the past. Alan Gross is now home with his family. That's an important step, progress that's been made, been commitments given by the Cubans. We'll see how they carry them out. So we have moved on to a new chapter. We're looking forward rather than back, and I think that's going to be good for the Cuban people and good for the United States.
Gentlemen, let's take a number that I suspect you can argue both ways, and that's the number of political prisoners in Cuba, which has risen from 2,000 in 2010 to 8,400, 4 times as many last month. Senator Cardin, I guess the question is, why reward a dictatorship that, as you can see in the last few years, has become more repressive, not less so?
I think the question would be, why continue a policy that hasn't brought about change? Let's try a different policy. So the number of political prisoners is outrageous. It's hurting Cuba. We know that. If they don't open up their society, their people are the ones who suffer. I think the more exposure we can give them to Americans, the better it's going to be. But we're going to continue to speak out in regards to the fault of their system.
Well, Senator Johnson, answer, if you will, Senator Cardin's question, which is, it hasn't worked. Why not try something different?
Well, again, it hasn't worked relaxing sanctions in Iran or North Korea, but let's listen to the words of some of these political prisoners from Castro. It is discomforting that the accounts of Castro regime can grow, as the first step will be more effective repression and a rise in the level of corruption. Another former political prisoner said, "This is a betrayal that leaves the Democratic opposition defenseless. Obama has allied himself to the oppressors and murderers of our people." These are people that in the past have been repressed and imprisoned by this evil regime. And again, I don't see relaxing sanctions working in Iran and South Korea or North Korea. Why would you expect that type of relaxation sanctions are going to work with the evil Castro regime?
Well, let's pick up on that, because that's the point, Senator Cardin, that you continue to make, which is there's going to be exposure to Western values, Western people, Western business, and that is somehow going to at least begin to open up Cuba. Here are some of the things that President Obama is going to be able to do unilaterally. Ease U.S. exports of building materials and agricultural and telecommunications equipment, establish banking relations between the two countries. Senator Johnson, let me get you to directly confront what Senator Cardin said. Do you think that that kind of relaxation, that kind of opening of business and trade between the two countries, even though we're not lifting the trade embargo, will that benefit the average Cuban?
No, the Cubans have had access to those kind of goods from other trading partners. And the Castro regime has remained every bit as oppressive and repressive as, you know, so that is not going to help the Cuban people at all. It's going to funnel funds into the Castro regime that they can use for creating mayhem in the Western Hemisphere. So it's just not going to work.
Senator Cardin, I mean, Senator Johnson does make a good point. Other countries have trade. Other countries have diplomatic relations, and it hasn't softened or eased the communist regime of the Castro brothers.
You know, I had a very interesting conversation with Alan Gross, who just talked about the underutilization.
He was an American who came down there to try to provide more internet access and ended up as a political prisoner or a hostage, whatever you want to call him, for what, 5 years?
5 years he was in the Cuban prisons, and he said the country is so underutilized. It's a country in which they don't even have enough vegetables to feed their people, and they have plenty of land and great weather. So I think that people are going to recognize the fact that their country is underperforming, and they're the ones who've been victimized by the Castro regime. That's going to come. We saw that with the fall of the communism in Europe as the Iron Curtain fell. That people want the type of standard of living they see in their neighbors, where they have more open and democratic societies. Cuba's close to the United States. It's in our hemisphere. It's our neighbor. It's a country that we have a direct interest. It's in our interest for Cuba to change. And this policy gives us hope that we'll see a different Cuba.
All right, gentlemen, we have a couple of minutes left, and I want to get to, I guess, really in the end, the big question as far as the two of you are concerned, which is what can Congress do about it? Senator Johnson, as an opponent, what can you do to block the opening of diplomatic relations, and what can you do to block the easing of trade limits?
Well, first of all, this is another example of President Obama spending a lot of time trying to circumvent the very clear spirit in the law of Helms-Burton. And again, that was a bipartisan effort. Chairman Menendez is saying the exact same thing. And so really, there's some real prescriptions in that Helms-Burton Act that you really have to, the administration has to follow some very specific steps before they lift the embargo. The president has not followed those. In other words, a determination that there's actually been a transition government. That hasn't happened. And so there are a number of things we can do to try and actually enforce the law that this president simply is ignoring.
Senator Cardin, look at it from your point of view. How effective can opponents be in blocking, for instance, the establishment of full diplomatic relations? You're certainly going to have a problem if the president decides to name an ambassador, getting him confirmed in a Republican-controlled Senate. And what about if they pass legislation to restrict any of the trade openings that he's making here unilaterally?
Well, you know, Ron's right. There's different views among Democrats on this subject. There's different views among Republicans on this subject. I think you're going to see a change developing in Cuba. The American people are going to get it. Our political system will want to be engaged. I think you'll see action in Congress. A lot can happen without direct congressional activity, but there will be a need for Congress to take action, hopefully, as we move to a new chapter in our Cuban relations. And it's going to be an interesting debate in Congress. And it's not going to be one party versus the other. It's going to be what we think is best in this country. And I hope Democrats and Republicans can come together and work on a new chapter in our relation with Cuba.
Senator Cardin, Senator Johnson, we want to thank you both so much for coming in today.